have between climate change and land, what are the impacts of climate change in terms of land use, crop yields, productivity, what are the impacts in terms of land degradation, how do you look at various issues of land use across different regions, but also the fact that it has, as any IPCC report would, three aspects. One is the climate science aspect of it. What specifically is it that we know about this, what is happening? The adaptation aspect, that is, how do we deal with these issues of climate impacts in a sustained and long-term manner, not simply cope up with it, but also change the way in which we produce things and have some understanding of who produces them and under what circumstances. And of course, mitigation, which is the newer concept which is introduced in agriculture, that is the reduction of emissions to mitigate the impact of climate change. Now, the reason why this report became extremely, sort of infamous in the media is because this was something which was caught on by every big media channel and commentator to make a few claims, which is that cows emit more than cars. Also, that one must reduce meat and dairy consumption, as well as the fact that there was a whole new metric introduced, which is food loss and food wastage at the international level. Earlier, this was something which was left to different countries to look at, but this report sort of gives emphasis for it to come back in a larger international negotiation. Now, the other thing is that this also stems from an earlier claims which have been going on across various reports. This, of course, is a rather more dubious Netflix documentary called Cowspiracy, which sort of aims to portray that meat eating is almost criminal with regards to the impact that it has on the environment in terms of climate change. But my whole contention is that if you look at this in isolation, you'll forget the fact that this is part of a larger shift in international relations in terms of dealing with climate change, which has been happening for a while. And that requires us to look at three aspects. One, there is something called as the Conference of Parties, the recent one which was held in Madrid post its cancellation at Chile, wherein signatories to the UNFCCC meet and discuss a plan of action with regards to what is to be done. Currently, of course, the main idea is how do you implement the Paris Agreement. And before this, of course, you had various other important COPs, Kyoto, Copenhagen, Cancun, Durban. And along with this, you also have the IPCC releasing a systematic review. So essentially, the IPCC doesn't produce the science. What it does is that reviews the state of science across three working groups. The first one looks at impacts of climate change, the second one looks at adaptation, and the third one looks at mitigation. And right now, we have 5 reports which have been published by the IPCC, the AR5 in 2017 being the last of them, and we are currently in the 6th assessment cycle, which is the AR6, which is supposed to come out anytime in the next year. Now, along with this, in each assessment cycle, they also come out with a special report. In this particular 6th assessment cycle, we've had 4 special reports. Now, these reports, again, do not produce the science, but review it and give an implication for what you want in terms of policy. Now, the first one was the 1.5 degree report, which I guess a lot of you would be familiar with, which is the argument that we must restrict global warming from pre-industrial levels to within 1.5 degrees Celsius. This was at the Incheon conference in 2018. You had the climate and land report, which is something I'm talking about. You then had the ocean and cryosphere report in 2019, and again in 2019 you had a change in the Convention for Greenhouse Gas Reporting, which is something which concerns the implementation of the Paris Agreement. How do you account for various greenhouse gases across different sectors? Now, before we get into that, this is still the fundamental basis of all international negotiations and agreements under the UNFCCC. Article 2, which speaks about the fact that the ultimate objective is the stabilization of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with climate systems, and 3.1, which speaks about the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. All right. In sum, we have one world and we have a stock, and remember, a stock of greenhouse gases that can be in the atmosphere, which is what is directly linked to global warming. Secondly, that different countries are unequal for various reasons. Historically, they are at different levels, so there is something called as intra-generational equity that we must strive to achieve, different levels of development if you want to call it that. And secondly, that to act on climate change and to deal with its impact, there is a common goal for all these countries, but it also must account for differentiation between different countries. It is not so much that people do not recognize this across different COPs or across different agreements. What is not being recognized is these aspects. And this is what you see repeatedly across different negotiations and also what comes out of Madrid. And one of the unfair almost criticisms which happens is that the developing countries, especially India, is sort of given the tag of being the slow moving elephant which is preventing a climate agreement from happening, or something which is ruining agreements and negotiations. So for instance, at Madrid, the EU came up with a new pledge saying that by 2050 everybody becomes carbon neutral. This is exactly what we need. And then everybody got on board with it, and you did have an entire block, and this was a refreshing change. G77, China, everybody saying that no, sorry, we will not going to accept this because you are not increasing your own commitments to it. And you had a standoff. So again, the developing world was blamed for not doing much, but hopefully I can give you some context as to why this is happening. Now, if I were to really quickly summarize, these are the three main shifts which happened in terms of how different countries are positioning themselves. I'm sort of clubbing India with all the other developing countries, but there are differences in positions, especially with China. But at the start, so across all these negotiations, everybody is clear that climate action in terms of reducing emissions, adapting to climate change needs to take place. Right? It's not the fact that anybody is disagreeing with this. Now the difference is, initially the USA kept playing ball by saying that unless India and China, who will be the future emitters, right, we will not make any changes in terms of our own actions. The EU sort of says that we take the lead. India and the rest of the developing world said that, we are really not responsible for this problem. Our share in terms of the total stock of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, as well as what we've contributed and what we need in the future, is not something that you can compare. It's something that you need to do. And in Kyoto, you actually have the only recognition of a differentiated world, because the agreement itself has a difference between what are called Annex 1 countries and non-Annex 1 countries. Essentially the developed and industrialized world and those who aren't. So the targets were all for the Annex 1 countries. Now then what happens is, somewhere halfway over here, the baseline for the targets shift. So it now becomes 1990. Now if 1990 is the benchmark that you use, now the emissions from the developing world relative to that of the developed world increases, as opposed to the historical emissions that have taken place from industrialization, as opposed to the other responsibility in terms of the stock of what you emit. And the reason why I'm saying stock is simply that carbon dioxide, which is the largest greenhouse gas, exists in the atmosphere to anywhere between 80 to 120 years. This is not true of the other greenhouse gases in terms of the time span. Methane, for instance, is a very much short-lived gas in the atmosphere. So essentially what you contribute to the atmosphere and what leads to an increase in temperatures is this stock. And that's why cumulative emissions are always a better scientific measure to use than annual emissions. But you lost that game right at the start. Let's say we even stick to annual emissions. That metric's again been moved out. Now it's 1990. In Madrid, the discussion was for 2005. Right? Now then what you have is, I will do this if the developing countries reduce. I will do this if the USA does something and the developing country does something. And the developing world now is, all right, I'll do something, it's not my problem, but I'll do something for it and I'll reduce emissions. All right? But equity is still something which the developing world fought for. But by the time the Paris Agreement comes, there is this entire celebration of it being the agreement reached and a consensus reached by the rest of the world. But the one thing that it really took a huge shot at was this question of equity and differentiation. You see, if every country pledges what is it that we are going to do in terms of reducing emissions, it still must add up to a situation where emissions actually start reducing. If everybody does whatever it is that they feel like and it doesn't actually suffice, then it is, remember, the developing world which will pay more for it. And I'll get back to this in the next slide. But the change that I want to point out is the following. You had differentiation and equity, and by now equity is something which has gone out of the agenda. All right? The emphasis in terms of how different articles are written, in terms of what are the pledges and what are the targets, it's something which is taken out of the equation. And let me just briefly tell you about the Paris Agreement, and this is something which I've taken from a former colleague's work, Tejal, which is, so this is essentially 4 situations wherein we have a particular stock of carbon dioxide, which is, or actually this is greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide, which is available to us. The first situation is if we want to retain global temperatures within 1.5 degrees with a 67% probability. This is a 50% probability, 67 and 50 for 2 degrees Celsius. Now, depending on the probability that you want and the temperature that is, the amount of carbon that you're allowed to emit from henceforth varies. All right. We have, of course, emitted quite a bit from now. So, what this analysis does is that it adds up all the pledges made by different countries and what are their nationally determined contributions, and builds up 2 scenarios. If the developed world does as much as it can, or the developed world does at least some of what it can. Till 2030, we are already emitting 204 gigatons carbon based on this. Now, beyond that, what is available for us to keep temperatures within this band? Minus 127, which means you can't keep it with a 67 probability under 1.5 degree. 50% probability, the amount of carbon space available for the rest of the world, the developed and the developing, is just this. If the developed world does far more and executes absolutely everything in terms of what they have mentioned as commitments, that's still out. 1.5 is here. All right, it is here anywhere between 2030 to 2050, it's here. But why is it that the Paris Agreement continues to maintain 1.5 degrees as its target? All right. The science of the matter, including AR5 and all other assessments, says is that the feasibility of 1.5 is not something that can actually happen. But nevertheless, is it not good that we have a more ambitious target? Not quite. Because a higher ambitious target means that you put an additional constraint on everybody else to reduce your emissions faster. This is still difficult to achieve. Chances are we will violate this also. But this still allows you some space in terms of what is the share available to the developing world and the developed world to actually emit. Now remember, when I say share to emit, I also mean that in the absence of a quick technology transfer, in the absence of changing various ways in which we produce things, you do require and you will require to emit greenhouse gases. And the idea is that you also need to improve standards of well-being, infrastructure, and access to services such as food, energy security for people in the developing world. And this is something which is at risk when you have an extremely ambitious target such as 1.5. Now, the other thing which it happens, which is that it also starts to violate some of your principles of the UNFCCC. Your commitments and your pledges are not adding up to actually stabilize what you want to. Secondly, you are assuming that all countries, even if they do something of their own will, are constantly being asked to increase the amount of mitigation commitments that they have. One of the most shocking parts of it, for instance, is that Ethiopia announces that it will be carbon neutral between 2030 to 2040. There is no reason why Ethiopia should be the one saying that we will be carbon neutral. I mean, in fact, by all means, they should be emitting a lot more in order to get out of where they are. And this brings us to the current report giving this context, which is the special report, and what it actually says about aspects of land, agriculture. Now, one of the important aspects of this report and a good part of the report is that for the first time it recognizes in a more comprehensive manner the importance of land and land use and the impacts of livelihoods which are related to land. So, whether it is crop productivity, yields, the issues of the permafrost melting, desertification, land degradation, the issues with soil nutrition changing, all of this is something which is comprehensively looked at by the SRCCL. And this also talks about impacts specifically in terms of food security, specifically in terms of what you do with declining yields. And this is something which it has in common with a previous IPCC assessment, which is the 5th assessment report, which talks about essentially that climate change with regards to agriculture is a subject where the developing world requires most action for adaptation. That is, ways and means by which you develop strategies to adapt to the impacts of climate change in terms of what do you do with these impacts for reduced crop yields. And this of course is something which is now well recognized in terms of what could be the range of change in yields across different crops based on the increase in temperature between 1 to 3. So, this is from the 5th assessment report. But there are some aspects of this report which are a cause for worry, especially with regards to developing countries. And this brings me back to the claim which is on the livestock sector. Now, prior to the release of this particular report, there are various other reports which have a claim on the livestock sector. So, you have this first report, this is what Cowspiracy talks about. Livestock sector emits 51% of the emissions. FAO released a report in 2006, Livestock's Long Shadow, where it claimed that it emits 18% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, more than the transport sector. It revised it in 2013 to say that it is 14.5%, which is still larger than the emission from the transportation sector. But what is it? How is it that the livestock sector is more than the sum total of all other sectors in one report, more than the transportation sector in some other report, and how does it keep fluctuating so much? And the FAO reports, remember, are also the basis used by the SRCCL to make that claim on livestock, which is also something which is being used in general to talk about reducing consumption of meat and dairy products. The first thing is that Goodlung and Anhang was not a peer-reviewed paper. It was completely discarded by the Life Cycle Studies Association, which of chemistry scientists who looked at how the study was done, and they said that there is no basis for them to make this claim. Now, the second giveaway is that all of these are life cycle assessments and life cycle emissions. That is, you will include everything from land use change at the start in agriculture and livestock right up to retailing, packaging and transport. But that calculation is not done for any other sector by any other report. So, what you essentially have is an apples and orange comparison. This is from the AR5. Just first this pie chart. The whole of land use change of land use patterns, agricultural lands, forest lands, diversion to urbanization, plus agriculture, plus all the industry in agriculture, plus livestock is only around 23 to 24% of the total emissions of the world. The majority still happens to be industry and energy, right? And transport is significant at 14%. And let's look at the last 10 years. Greenhouse gas emissions have actually been growing across all sectors in the last 10 years, and the only sector where it hasn't increased is actually AFOLU, that is agriculture, forestry, land use change. If you look at the assessment from AR5 of what you know for an annual basis, that's what you have. 35% of the emissions by the energy sector, 24% from AFOLU, 21% by industry, 14% by transport, 6.4% by the building sector. A small guess as to what you think is only the contribution of livestock? I mean, there are various range of estimates, some of them change, but what do you think livestock actually is in terms of the total world emissions? Okay. Sorry? 13. Okay. It's actually 5%. And this is the reason why the methodology of the FAO report did a life cycle assessment. So it counted everything right from the start to the end. And that is what it claimed as 18% first, and they revised it down to 14.5% because, well, there was a problem in terms of how they calculated it. If it were only operational emissions, that is to operate that sector as is without talking about everything that goes into it, every nut, bolt, transportation, fossil fuel used into it, livestock is only at 5%, transport is at 14%. And this is something which the FAO repeatedly claimed after it released its report, that you can't essentially compare these two figures. This is exactly from the clarification from the FAO, the useful diagram included. And they point to a very other important thing, which is that there is an implication when you start saying that emissions are high in livestock more than transport and you want to reduce it. And that implication is to a vast section of the world which not only has poorer living standards, but also has poorer intakes of various forms of nutrients and proteins in particular, which is why meat and dairy become important. And most of the people who are living close to poverty or below it are also pastoralists, small peasants and small farmers, which means that their livelihoods and incomes are also critically linked to livestock. So two things. One, if you start saying that you need to increase the reduction of emissions or commitments to mitigation within livestock sector, these are the people who will pay the most in terms of their incomes and livelihoods. But these are also the people who will pay the most simply because it's a constraint in what they eat. Just to quickly run you through, every country, every region at different stages of development, as it increases, as their standards of living increase, their nutritional intake in terms of protein becomes better. This is where meat and dairy becomes important. Now, I am not trying to say that this doesn't mean that you can have conspicuous consumption, that there is no limit to it, all right? But there is an importance for this shift to take place. And if we are talking about conspicuous consumption and who really needs to look at it, this is India in terms of its per capita annual meat consumption. This is the whole of Africa. So, this is around 3.7 kgs, and this is just around 12, I think. And the world average is here. This is the USA. China, of course, is making some rapid stride in terms of improving it. But if you are still convinced, despite the science of it all, that livestock and reducing dietary consumption of meat and dairy is where you need to work at, again, putting that target on the developing world is really something which defies where it is that we stand in terms of our nutritional intake of protein and where we are at in terms of what we contribute to the world. Full caveat, it's India, so the political aspects of meat eating and vegetarianism is not something that you can discount. Everybody has a right to eat whatever they do, but of course in India it becomes a difficult issue. And just to prove the point that this is also something which is uptaken by various other sections in terms of saying that meat eating is a problem for social as well as environmental reasons, where clearly it is not. The other aspect which I want to point out based on these analyses is that these reports again push out equity and differentiation. So by talking about the livestock sector as a whole and doing a life cycle analysis without doing it for other sectors, without looking at meat consumption standards across different countries and saying that you need to reduce emissions, you are really doing away with these concepts of equity and differentiation. Cows emits more than cars is really a fallacy in terms of how the data was represented. And this is something which it has in continuation with the other special report, which was the 1.5 degree special report. Now remember, I already told you about how the 1.5 degree target itself is something which is not just too high a target, but it also is something which forces you to reduce emissions far more on the developing world. It has no reference to differential capabilities. What is retained across both is the concepts of REDD+ and climate smart agriculture, or other ways in which you change markets and institutions to deal with emissions and climate change. Maybe we can pick that up in the Q&A. And food wastage is something which is mentioned across both. And in both, it somehow seems to be that there is a trade-off put between food security and production in agriculture and emissions. Now remember, AFOLU entirely only is 23%. The major basis of emissions continues to be industry, energy and transportation. By putting the blame or laying the onus of this trade-off between better well-being and emissions on food security and agriculture, you are really singling out the developing world. Secondly, these trade-offs, that is, I'll have higher emissions in order to achieve food security or in order to improve agricultural yields and production, is something which takes place more so in the developed world than the developing world, simply because there's a greater component of fossil fuel use across different stages of how things are produced in agriculture and livestock in the developed world. Now, using that as a basis of saying that you need to do something about this sector is putting the onus on the developing world. And while you mention any of these strategies, you have not mentioned differentiation. So you give an absolute number and then you say we have to reduce it. This is your target. Everybody has to do it. But really, who is at what level contributing to this is something which is escaping from the debate. And this brings us to the coinage of an important new metric which the FAO came up with, which is food loss and wastage. Right? Now you can look at different types of food crops and livestock. You can have an environmental measurement by saying that, you only spoke about carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. That's not the only way in which you look at an environmental impact. There are other impacts apart from climate change. So you can have a blue water footprint, or you can have a land footprint, that is per unit quantum of producing something, what is its footprint in terms of the amount of land it uses, the amount of water it uses, the amount of carbon dioxide that's emitted. And here is a new metric which is food loss and food waste. Again, just a small pointer, the only place where meat and animal products actually increases as opposed to cereals, crops and others is the land footprint. And even here it is largely disproportionate due to large scale pastoral emissions from land use change in the Americas, both the continents. Food wastage is, remember, something in that 1.5 and the new report said that everybody must look into. Now, this isn't something which is directly related to climate change or carbon emissions, but it is something nevertheless that everybody has to do. But food wastage just in itself doesn't make sense. And the FAO and everybody else said that we have two different things. One is food loss. What happens when you produce something and what happens till it goes to the retailer in terms of the different losses. So post-harvest, there could be an extreme event. There could be losses in storage. There could be losses in transportation. All right? And wastage is really what happens from the retailer to the end consumer. The only available stats that we have right now is for food loss. Food wastage is something the UNEP is coming up with and we don't know. But the claims made across all report is 1/3 of all the food in the world is wasted. The only thing we do know is that 14% of all the food produced is lost. And that's what the FAO recently came up with. And where is it lost? Central Asia, Southern Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, North America and Europe. Oil crops, roots and tubers, fruits and vegetables, cereals and pulses. So it is an important measure, but the question is at what stage of the production is it that you want to reduce this? If you maintained a distinction between food loss and food wastage, you would then say that food loss is more important for the developing world. So these are the factors and areas where the developing world needs to look at. If you simply coin the term food wastage, it's essentially something which is interpreted as eating too much or wasting what you eat. And that again gives an unfair picture of really what's happening and where such wastage takes place. And again, the emphasis of that is that you need to improve or change the type of consumption or dietary habits that you have. So repeatedly over the last 5 years, you have this effect where a disproportionate burden is put on the developing world. You have increased mitigation targets, you've improved mitigation targets on sectors such as agriculture and livestock, and what you essentially have is something which is not being covered, which is that the idea that simply limiting global temperature rise will somehow take care of all the other problems that we have, whether it is environmental, land use, water, the questions, more traditionally of what is called access, availability, affordability of different resources. Is it a question of water scarcity everywhere, or is it a question of availability, access? Is it a question of infrastructure? These are some things which various different sciences and social sciences have looked at, but somehow everything is now subsumed under climate change. And while there is some use to it in terms of figuring out what this impact is, it also means that it is chipping away at the other larger socio-economic inequalities that most of us have been working out. And this is something which unwittingly a lot of us also fall prey to. And this is what it's hiding. In the last 30 years, the developed world has done almost nothing in terms of reducing emissions. A few countries have actually increased their emissions. The USA, remember, drives how the negotiation takes place, and then it absconds and leaves treaties. Paris was not the first time they did it. They did this in Kyoto and then they left. They are not part of the Kyoto targets. The same thing happens in Paris again. And this is really where you need to focus on, and this is why at Madrid, even though the USA is not part of the agreement, they were driving how is it that the agreement had to take place. The EU starts with this whole new claim. So forget everything else that happened before Paris. It's a new world, it's a new target, 1.5 is a target, and we have to do everything by 2050. And this is where finally the developing world is like, wait, what just happened? How do you do this again? We know this playbook, and well, it just seems that they at least stood up this time around, but we're not sure what will happen in subsequent COPs. And to just give you some emphasis of why equity and differentiation is important, perhaps you could also look at, let's say, some of the changes which took place, even the way Greta Thunberg started to articulate the whole issue. At the start of it, it was the how dare you, the fact that the okay boomers are not doing much, but if you look at a recent speech in Madrid, there's really an understanding a bit more in terms of how is it that you need to look at equity, differentiation, and how is it that the developing world really cannot actually take up the entire burden of mitigation, and that it must be the largest emitter is not part of your climate agreement. How is that acceptable? And instead we are often squabbling about changes of consumption and lifestyle being applied to the developing world. So I'll sort of end with that, sort of a brief overview of what the topic was, and perhaps we could have some question and answers. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Fascinating overview of all of the negotiations and the implications for food security and meat waste. You also must be familiar with the Eat Lancet Commission.
Sorry?
Report. You must also be familiar with the Eat Lancet Commission report.
The Lancet papers on heat. Yes, sure. Yeah.
So they also sort of played to this. They played to the same.
Yes.
Sort of, very Euro and US centric. And then recently, of course, they've also come up with the World Diet.
Yeah.
And it all plays to the same.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, yeah.
And it was just a quick comment rather than anything else.
No, actually, so some of the work, in fact, some of us were doing it is, you could actually do it for many more sectors. The Lancet report, for instance, also starts linking so health with global warming temperatures. But so to put a very small thing, this whole thing about increase in vector-borne diseases such as malaria, right? Now, all said and done, there may be some contributing climatic factors which lead to it. But the reason why Florida doesn't report even 2 malarial deaths in 10 years, whereas other tropical places in the world reports it, is it really because of increased temperatures or the absence of an health infrastructure? So the idea is that whether it's agriculture, industry, heat waves, health, there is an existing socio-economic base of inequalities that are there across the world, and it's on top of that that you have these exacerbations from climate variation, and that's exactly what you're saying in terms of the Lancet report. If you look at the 1.5 and other reports, there's every other sector that you name it, this is there, yeah.
You use the word equity many times.
Yeah.
What exactly does it mean? I don't have a background in this.
Okay, sure. So there are 2 things that it means. One is intra-generational equity, that is within the same generation across different parts of the world. What are the different levels of development, standards of living? You can use different metrics to arrive at it, that people actually have. Now, this essentially points down that you have an unequal world wherein you have different standards of living across different countries, also within those countries, and in order to actually reduce this, you require the improvement in the access, availability and physical presence of various infrastructure, goods and services. Okay? And if you are going to do this, this would require you to emit something. So, in terms of the targets given to different countries, it should be cognizant of this difference. So, what it would take, for instance, our per capita energy consumption is abysmally low as compared to mid-level developing countries, other East Asian countries, of course, the developed world. So, if you need to increase it, it means that you also understand that you don't think that people should only live with 1 light bulb and 1 tube light. It means to have a better standard of living, which means you have a proper house, for instance. So, all of that requires emissions, and also all of that requires that the developing world has a better share of it. So, that is the context in which I use the word equity.
So, I find that a little confusing.
Yeah, okay.
Because in a sense, even if it's not expressed so, the standards for development or standards for development or livelihood and lifestyle is somehow the West, but we are always saying the West is taking more than what it deserves. So how exactly did we arrive at what is required?
Sure.
What minimum standards of living?
Okay, so I mean, I don't have it right now.
Okay. Have nothing to do with population and population density.
That it doesn't have anything to do.
Does it not have anything to do with population and population density?
Okay, it's 2 parts to it. Okay, so I don't have it right now, but okay, let's say that you take any plot. You plot per capita energy use, which HDI or GDP. You take, just let's focus on energy for instance. Energy against infant maternal mortality, energy against maternal mortality, energy against HDI. You will see a typical shoulder curve, alright? That is a curve which is something like this. Now, on the other end, upper end of the curve, you will have various developed and industrialized countries where there is an increase in energy use per capita, which is really disproportionate from what they have achieved in terms of either reducing mortality or improving HDI. But there are a range of countries on the shoulder, Portugal for instance, or other places, China is slowly going up to them, other countries in East Asia, where you have levels and standards of energy use and energy consumption which is proportionate with the level of HDI and reduction in all these other parameters. So, it is not as if it is only the global north which is being compared as a standard, but the thing is that there are certain minimum basic standards which are there, which are mentioned. Let us say the ILO has something which is called as what is a basic minimum thing which is required in terms of housing, right. So you have proper roofs, tiles, access to sanitation, waste, sewage, etc. All of that becomes part of it. So there is some objectiveness also to these parameters and standards, and it's not necessary that I only speak about an extreme standard in the industrialized world. And in terms of your contradiction that you were talking about, you first say the West is consuming too much and then you say that the standards are there. But really those countries which are consuming too much are really on outliers in terms of the rest of the world. So there is some level where you can reach without actually going there. The second question, so in terms of the population aspect of it, for a given, now, as much as it is the idea that you need to ensure that goods and services need to be equitably distributed and at an affordable price and made available to a large section of population, and that's a constraint that one faces, I acknowledge that problem. But beyond that, the entire history of development tells you that as your levels of development improve, access to goods and services increase and population reduces. So the levels of well-being is what actually determines population across different regions and not the other way around. So,
just in your per capita, again, just another comment, your per capita meat consumption, you left out Argentina and Brazil.
Yeah, sure. Actually, there's another graph which I have which has all of that, and so in fact,
pretty high up there.
yeah. So now this land footprint, for instance, is largely because of what is called rainforest beef, and over there, one of the things is also, and there are issues in terms of how they calculate it, but essentially the conversion of vegetation and pastoral land into land for livestock is something which is there. And there are some small studies which did say that for a brief period in Brazil, this actually reduced. Now, some people do put it to the changes in administration over there. I'm not quite sure if that's exactly the reason, but there is a possibility of, reducing the intensity of resource consumption in terms of livestock even in the Americas. And that is, yes, that is an important factor contributing to it, yeah.
Aravindhan,
Yeah.
I enjoyed your presentation. It was fascinating. I don't have any questions. I just want to, at the end of your presentation, for all the bickering between developed, developing, I just feel despair that it's one world, one earth after all. So forget about, I do acknowledge that we need to look at these issues of equity, but in the end, what we are forgetting is that it's just one earth, one atmosphere, and as we keep bickering, we are just going out of control there. It's just a note of despair that I feel.
Sure. And maybe I can counter it with a small note of optimism, which is that it's not always the things can't come to an agreement. If you look at what is the Montreal Protocol in terms of what we have to do with CFCs, all right. When the ozone layer was rapidly shrinking, this is something which all countries did recognize. There's also a massive difference in terms of the available technologies across the developed and the developing world in terms of how you deal with it. 25 years later, the ozone layer has recovered. It's not as if it's completely back to a better area, but it has massively changed largely because of the fact that all countries did come together and could figure out a way in which they address these issues of equity, technology transfer. Of course, if it comes to climate change, it's a whole new ball game, but I don't see why that can't happen. So sometimes, of course, this is not to say that nobody does anything, but I still feel that you can have an agreement which is based on equity and differentiation, and it's still possible. So complete despair also sometimes gives the idea that, we must do something, and that also has consequences. Sure. Well, all that I'm saying is that, let's say, even if no, I understand. I mean, I've grappled with this many a times, but essentially, if those set of developed world and industrialized countries don't reduce drastically their emissions in industry, energy, and transport, even if we do all these other measures also, in say out of despair because nothing's happening, it will still not add up to much. So I still think that this is the fight which is important even for that. Yeah.
In terms of wastage concern, where India we are standing as one thing, the wastage, in terms of wastage.
Okay.
Where do we stand? That's one thing. And the secondly, any reason behind that, initially the emission was very, very high in terms of, the livestock, they are miscalculated, those things. What are the reason behind it?
Reason behind?
Behind, the miscalculation behind the livestock, the emission put on
as to
livestock.
why?
Yes. That, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so in terms of the food loss and wastage, the FAO is just releasing its index in terms of food loss.
Right.
Food wastage is something which the UNEP still hasn't come up with. So, country-wise, it's still not available. What I have is those regional aggregates that I have. I am still willing to speculate that this is more largely in India post-harvest, especially because of issues of damages to crops, transportation and storage losses, where this would be more in India. It's an educated guess. I don't have that index for India yet. So once that happens, maybe there's a better answer that I can give for that. Why did it do that? See, the FAO categorically calculated emissions only for that sector and not for anything else. And traditionally, for all other sectors, you don't do a life cycle emission count. Now, I can say two things. One, that they genuinely didn't know, and they did come up with clarifications post it. Secondly, it's also a larger drive towards recognizing that the livestock sector and agriculture sector is where you should do more emission reduction, which is also, a pressure which is put on the developing world. In fairness to the FAO, they have clearly stated that you can't do this comparison. They've come out with remarks saying that this is not what you do. But once that report is out, you have everybody from Richard Attenborough, Prince Charles, anybody, he'll come up, they'll say that, yeah, we are eating too much meat and everybody must turn vegetarian or vegan. It's a very crude way of putting it, and the basis of a lot of it was those two reports. So, these are the only explanations that I have for the motivation for it.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. In fact, I enjoyed it so much that I was thinking it would make a really nice podcast that, I can share it with my friends and family. I have two questions. One is related to Roshni's, in a way. I was wondering if the scale of it, because the scale is so huge of climate change related, whatever discussions, issues, because of the scale, does it become a utilitarianistic argument by essence? And then if you look at it through institutional angle, how do you bring more power to smaller units within all of these countries? Like, say, for example, we talk about states in India having more power in deciding how they want to develop. Similarly, is there a way of, I don't know.
Yeah, no, okay. Yeah, the second.
Second question? Yeah, second question, somewhat related to Siddhapal's. So the reason for focusing so much on livestock, is it because it puts pressure on individuals to change their lives? Whereas if you blame industries and larger structures, then it becomes a difficult, situation politically, like it's easier to tell people what they can change in their personal lives.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, if I can take the second question first, it's also a general truism within actions on the environment that What is an easier uptake to do is something where, if you're convinced that your individual action can lead to a larger change. That is something which inherently is something which is what a lot of people would be motivated in terms of action. But the question is again that even if you do that, it doesn't add up. So even if I were to take, I want to reduce things in livestock, remember the largest emissions in livestock take place in terms of land use, in terms of fossil fuel use in production, packaging. That is not something that you will change by reducing the amount of, or changing it. There are various concepts. There is this fad called the food mile, which had started in the UK and which is now coming to India. So essentially that we should not have food which is grown elsewhere or at a farther distance from what it comes to our dinner plates. And the UK, they tried it for 5 years, they analyzed the stats on it and they realized that most of the emissions happen because you have to constantly go up and down between your house and the supermarket or the retail store, and that's where the emission takes place. And if it's being transported from New Zealand to the UK, that's like 1 million tons of stuff which goes there in one go. So the emissions are again lopsided. So yes, one thing is individual action does not lead to such larger changes, and climate change is essentially a global problem and not a local one. This is where this issue does become difficult. How is it that you make industrialized and developed world act largely on reducing their emissions? The second thing is within what you said now, essentially the whole idea is that you hold the nation state who are treaties to the UNFCCC is to be accountable to what emission targets that they set. But it is for them to decide based on their political, socio-economic conditions in terms of how they actually go about doing it, and that reflects in the targets that they set. So countries such as Ethiopia, other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, unfortunately India is increasingly not meeting a lot of its development targets. It's up to us to figure out what is it that we would require in order to have this space to do something, right? And then of course you actually go about ensuring equity within your own country. What we do have is across different governments internationally we have fought for equity, but of course internally within the country that is something which becomes a miss. But the other threat to this is increasingly pledges and how you act on climate change is now being left up to individuals, corporations and entities that undertake various activities. Once that starts to take place, then you have a really dilution of accountability and equity even further, and this is exactly something which a lot of people have been warning about since Paris, that this is an entry door to doing this. And also it's an easier uptake for everybody. So McDonald's doing climate smart agriculture, Walmart is doing climate smart agriculture, it makes sense. But are they really at the same scale as other individual farmers in the developing world? So, yeah.
Do you know how these emission targets are met or how it's calculated per nation? Given that there's so much trade, so India imports, say, something from China. So the production is happening in China.
Sure.
Transport, say, by an Indian ship carrier or whatever. So
no, so that is something which is accounted for because in terms of, let's say, what is called world trade data, you have stats in terms of what are the quantum and means by which different types of trade takes place. So for each sector, if say X proportion of something came from some other country through a particular mode of transportation, so you will have an emission factor for that transportation, you will have a share of that quantum of good in that sector. So based on that, you estimate what is the contribution of it. You ensure that there are differentiation in emissions in terms of what has been imported and exported. So that's something which is accounted for. What becomes difficult otherwise is what the Paris Agreement now wants is that you want to have about some, say, more than a 95% accuracy in terms of reporting all your emissions. How do you do that for the unorganized sector? That becomes a challenge, and it is going to be a challenge. It will, however, lead to the birth of a lot of data analysts and data consultancies who will not run out of a job. But it is going to be a problematic aspect to look at accuracy at the level of each individual enterprise, and that's another challenge, in fact, which the developing world is facing.
no further questions. Thanks, Aravindhan.
Thank you.
Lovely talk.